I've got a question for everyone. So I've been thinking about trust. What is trust? How do you create trust? What exactly is it? And I've been thinking about it in light of anger as well. That is a topic of interest. I'd be curious, Mr. Jockin, how do you establish trust in the classroom or on the work site? How do you go about thinking about creating trust with your students, between clients, et cetera, so forth?
Probably base minimum is related to correspondence of word and action. So for when you said I'm doing X or we're going to do X and then you do that, it gives a foundation of trust in the sense that there's the weight of my words actually has consequence behind it that they can rely on. That's one stance. Other stance would be uh, usually in the teaching environment, if you're doing the activity with the pupil, it instantly not only does build trust, that concept of buy-in occurs a little bit much more rapidly. So, especially if it's laborious or tedious or something else there's a very different experience, a willingness to engage in the activity. Well, a lot less complaining, a lot more willingness to engage with it if they see the instructor or practitioner doing it with them. It also builds a lot of authority by doing that too. So the trust, authority.
And I'm sorry, I don't know why I froze. I'm sad.
No, it's all good. I'll just re-summarize.
Yes, sir.
Basically, first is by doing what you say you're going to do and then doing it. So that builds trust by I trust your words because there's a correspondence between action and thought because your words are correspondent to it. That's number one. Number two, doing activity, especially in the teaching environment with pupils, when you're doing the activity with the students, that creates buy-in, establishes authority, way more willingness to learn. They're willing to trust your guidance in the exercise activity because you're doing it with them. So if you're doing something especially laborious or tedious, they see that you're doing it with them. It allows them to kind of engage more actively. It also has a secondary effect, especially if you're producing works that is demonstratively superior. That gives you it establishes the authority that I should listen to this person because he actually knows what he's doing. So that'd be a secondary effect to it. So words to actions, participation in the activity, exercise, and demonstrating through that as a way to build trust as fast as you can in the teaching environment.
Excellent. I'll pass it to Luber. I was listening to an individual talking about a difference between human trust and task trust, saying that very often people conflate these things together. And it was very interesting because there does seem to be, the word trust is very interesting to me because it's something that seemingly everyone knows is good and that we should aspire to. But then how do you create trust is also very interesting because I can't just tell you, trust me. Because if I tell you to trust me, that's probably the most untrustworthy thing ever, right? I can't command trust. It's something that, and also there's a weird, mysterious moment where I don't know if a person consciously says, I will now trust, X or Y. Just they find themselves trusting the individual, right? They just find themselves kind of buying in to the individual. And that's interesting. And so there's the task trust, the person was saying, which is, the trust that they will get a task done. But then but in addition to that, it's interesting to think there seems to be almost a human trust, as she was saying, which is the idea that when I talk to you, I know you're not going to attack me. When I talk to you, I know you're actually going to listen. When I talk to you, I know you're not going to just be using me as a means to an end. So I've been thinking too about how there's like a task trust and a human trust. And then there's also a kind of trust in the artistic process. You trust that this is going to go somewhere. You trust that there's a vision here. There's a certain trust and courage. So the word trust is very interesting. Let me pass it to Luber, though. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir.
Good to see you guys too. Yeah, I think if you approach trust from like an ontological, perhaps even just like a phenomenological perspective, if you take you know relational ontology seriously, I think trust would be something where it has to do with like empathy in a way as well, in the sense that you're both, you and the other are both have similar access to like what's relationally present, or just like what is like even like at a task level, it's like that task has like some relational foundation in order to like be on the same page about the tasks. Sure, there's like a repetition in accomplishing the task, but even like prior to that, there's understanding to a certain degree that relational foundation, and in that sense, the trust, the task can be bestowed onto somebody else because both parties are seeing eye to eye to some degree on that relational foundation. But um, I think I think trust for me, there's like there's different ways to talk about it. You could talk about trust in terms of like how do you form trust, or or like how do you understand trust. For me, understanding trust is like relational based, like I was just saying. But how to come about trusting, if you take relational ontology seriously, again, that also to me comes with like vulnerability, like a type of opening yourself up to the other, where like how you are perceiving a certain relational foundation is revealed, and that the other person can either articulate or just even you know uh, like body language. It doesn't have to be like verbal, where there's a certain stance, let's just call it a certain stance taken, that shows that you're to a certain degree seeing the ontological relation in question. I think the problem with trust is that it's always a it's a momentary thing. So you can I was just watching Squid Games, and I don't I don't want to spoil, but is it okay if I spoil? Like, tell me. Okay, I'm gonna spoil. Spoiler alert. Hopefully this gets more views because Squid Games. um, there's a character that's not a good guy. He's a bad guy. That he's a bad guy. That infiltrates the good guys via being vulnerable, transparent, and then like concealing certain facts about him that make him a bad guy, concealing those things well. Um, he gains the trust for all the right reasons, and right when the decision where he's like actually a bad guy, even though he won the good guy side, it makes sense. Like in the unfolding of his quote unquote revealing vulnerable things for trustworthy purposes, all those things were still true, and yet he's a bad guy. And yet, like, you still shouldn't trust them, even though you're aware, even though for majority of the unfolding, the ontological, the foundational relation that they're both parties are aware and are penetrating each other's perspective on that ontological relation. So even though that's happening for majority of the unfolding, within that still contains the possibility of a divergence of some way, precisely because you're both coming from how do I say this, from your perspective, you're reflecting in a certain sense on the other person's penetration of the relation, and you can match that because you also are having your own penetrating relation to the foundational relation. But because there's that difference, it gives rise to the possibility of a divergence in what is to be trusted. Exactly. So that to me is the hard problem of trust, because if you think about it like that, faith, it's very obvious where faith comes in. Like you just have to like have hope and faith that the unfolding continues in accordance to where it started. And because it's in an unfolding and there's this like temporal gap to like the resolute reveal of the trust, that's why trust kind of has to go hand in hand with faith in that respect. And then one more thing, and then I'll pass it off. I've been talking a lot. Uh, a hallmark. If you feel here's a good way of, here's a suggestion to like whether the unfolding is going to lead to a divergence, essentially. Um, if you feel as if you have every question answered about the other, there's a good chance that there's going to be a divergence. But if you're aware of what you are unsure about, then the possibility of divergence is less likely for trust. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. And then also just one quick thing. I did a good amount of I read because I know oh my god, I can't believe I forget his name. Oh my god, help me out. Help me out for a sec. Letting Beings Be.
Heidegger?
Win.
Oh, Thomas
Win.
Wynne.
This
I
was
was going to
the
say him.
guy.
Yeah.
So Wynne talks about that piece that Heidegger wrote, like on the essence of truth, because he talks about letting beings be in that, and I read that again. I revisited that this week. So it's just reading just helps thinking, and I was not reading as much when I was making this movie, and I could feel it. It's actually funny. It's like an actual feeling. It's like a muscle weakened. But yeah, that's the tangent. Sorry, just wanted to say that.
No, I think it's well, and Clayton, good to see you. So we're talking. I asked, what is trust? We're talking about trust because there's something very interesting about trust. It reminds me of anger in the sense of, don't we know what anger is? And there's some sort of mystery in it. There's some sort of depth to it. Because the reason, if we're gonna talk about an open, consistent system, encounter, surprise, courage, absolute choice, orbiting, relation, all of these have something to do with trust, right? They have some sort of trust element that is part of it. What's also interesting is I wonder if thinking is thinking if it's not trusting it. Like, it seems as if thinking requires something like trust in it to be thinking, or else it's just calculation. Because like you mentioned Mr. Wynn on the letting be. Well, is not letting be trusting in some regard? Like trusting the letting, trusting the unfolding, trusting the beauty, trusting the surprise. So what is like, is it possible, like, is real thinking have something to do with a kind of trusting or a letting? But Mr. Luber, please.
Sorry, this is a tangent, but like just so you can like sit on this. I was thinking about this today, like just thinking about, the things that you talk about with encounterology, which I agree with, but I'm always challenging the things that I agree with. So like forgive me. I'm making something with a stove, okay? I won't know that it's hot until I touch it. So like when is it a good time to not actually encounter? Like I don't know, like I never thought about that. Like to me, encounterology like suggests that you ought to put yourself out there for encountering, and that like there's a risk at that because it could be something really bad happening. But like at what point does repetition require you to say, I'm not going to encounter that now? Like how many times do I need to touch the stove? If at all, you know? Sorry, but
No, that's
that has
outstanding.
nothing to do with what we're talking about.
No,
So
no, no.
sorry.
It I think it's very relevant and does, because this is where memory is important. This is where the inevitability of encounter is important. This is where pattern is important. This is where also when you touch a stove and you've encountered it, you actually know what's going to happen. So there's a way in which it's not an encounter because the outcome is ranged in the predictability, right? A real encounter has some sort of, you're not even you really don't, you're open to a sense of the way that it unfolds. But when you touch a stove, you gradually come to learn that there's a pretty relatively predictable range of outcomes that can occur, right? Now, maybe not. So that's why you shouldn't assume that you always know, but always you're not crazy to estimate that touching a stove has a pretty general range of things that are going to occur, none of which are necessarily good, right? So there's a way in which it actually ceases to be an encounter, but participation in a repetition, right? Like you're just participating again in a repetition. Whereas with an encounter, what's happening with there is the emphasis. The weird thing also about the encounter is you can't, if you plan the encounter, it's not an encounter. It has to be surprising. So the moment you say, I'm going to touch this stove because it's going to be like a shock or different things, well, then it actually isn't going to possibly destabilize your being and open you, because it's actually something you already kind of know of what it's going to occur, right? So the encounterology gets really tied up with the surprise and then preparation for that of which you can't know of ahead of time. So I would say this. Encounter, the language we use and I'll give it to Jockin and Michelle. We use language in reconstructing ASA of high order causality and low order causality. And low order causality is basically two billiard balls go across the table, they hit and they move, right? High order causality is two billiard balls roll across the table, hit, and I remember to call my sister who I used to play billiard balls with, right? Like, you know, it's a cause and effect, but it is not one that you can predict. And the high order causality actually is quite open. You can't, and my high order causality on billiards could be different from yours, from Michelle's, et cetera, so forth, right? Like when you're dealing with encounterology, you're going to be moving more so in the direction of high order causation versus low order causation. And to the degree the encounter is something that actually is not going to unveil to you something that you couldn't predict, is to the degree that you're actually encountering something as opposed to just participating in an unfolding. So it's going to be moving more so in the direction of high order causation than low order causation. But this also starts getting into why there seems to be something about trust. Because in trust, like in a low order causation, you don't really need trust. You just witness the participation. You just kind of witness the thing unfolding. Now, of course, these things all blur because it's possible that this is the one billiard ball in the planet that when you hit, you know, it doesn't move or something, right? So you're always making guesses and estimations. That way, that's why we say rationality has a lot to do with making good bets. And there's always the possibility of something you don't think is going to entail a surprise does entail a surprise. But generally speaking, those are the distinctions. But the very fact that you can't systemize it is also why there always has to be a certain human element involved. And you mentioned empathy, and this absolutely starts going in the direction of empathy once we get to the human element. But I will pass it to Mr. Jockin and Michelle. Let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, good conversation so far. You know, it's from Dan, he replying and Luber talking a little bit as well. One part of this about this trust and complete tasks, that's offboarding. That's one element. That's what we mean by like when we delegate a cognition of thought or effort to something else or someone else, that's trusting them. So I trust Google Maps is going to send me, it's going to tell me where to go. I'm going to trust, basically, I trust this person to do this errand for me, right? To do this thing. I don't have to think about it, right? So thought gets turned off. It gets kind of turned off and moved away. And that's why we trust the stove. We know what the stove's going to do, and I put the pot in and water goes in and it works. And then when we get a surprise that it doesn't work, something's either it doesn't work or whoops, it was on, but we didn't know, surprise, but it's only related to that function, like it's specific to some expectation of task to complete. So I think that's a useful way to talk about that. But that ties into, you know, I was listening to a lecture earlier today. It was quite good. We do that with culture, disciplines, practices, culture. Those are all modes of trust because we're offloading thought or processes to other entities or other things, systems, processes, relations that we rely on, lean on. And isn't it interesting is usually we need to rely on, because we rely on, like, for example, language. We're not inventing a new language for us to talk with each other. We all have to use English right now and have enough coherence in that to understand what we're talking about with each other, for example. Or when you're in a discipline, like in my classes, there's actually related to that is that actually depends. You also, to qualify your original question, depends which level I'm dealing with here. If I'm dealing with freshmen or beginners, it's the onboarding problem, as we discussed in the past. They have to get in tune of the practice of design. And so what you're teaching them is those things, right? Versus the building of trust for practitioners who are already in the discipline is different because of that fact. I could point to and rely on this culture, this practice as a mechanism of coordination. And that's one of the things trust tends to do. It is, you know, it's an object of faith, right? Because we trust, like, that's the point. These are objects of faith. We're trusting that it's going to do, we can rely on it to do things. That's why I see that part of that same constellation of delegation, basically, offloaded delegation, trust. But there is another one. And it relates to risk taking, to risk and courage and all that. It is one is that there's certain goods or object of intent. I'm reading Aquinas, so I'm going to use that language. Certain objects of intention or certain goods are only going to be I cannot do by myself. I need others to do it with. So I need this discipline. I need this thing to help me move forward. For there's some good that's better, that's superior to something I can get on my own. That's that direction. This discussion of memory and pattern and repetition. And the encounter and the surprise, I had a note because you said, Daniel, you made a comment, thought and calculation. I remember our last net session together about commitment to a belief system. That is absolutely in play in this, because that's the point. Are we using our belief system and kind of like, as Javier pointed out, it's just a operational apologetics just to present the model and just articulate it, right? Versus using the model and pushing it to its limits and then seeing where it breaks down, kind of what Luber was just doing. Like he wanted to see what the limit of that thought process was. That's a different relationship. One is kind of a mode of trust where you're just operating with it to do things, do work for you. Another one is that other kind of trust is, that's the thing with thought. See, the biggest problem with thought, I was going to comment, is that we trust it so easily. We take it, we just say it obvious. We see this a lot actually in relationships, by the way, when people use "you're this," they get caught up in the words of what they're saying, and they absolutely believe these words are the truth. You're a narcissist. You're this. You're that. And you feel that feeling. That's what you got, and it's with just full conviction. We're so convinced by these phantasms in the mind and these words and words generated from that to be the actual reality, and we operate from that. We're very easily captivated to and it actually relates to anger. Like part of the reason why, I think some people got pushed. I noticed I got some common pushback from the net group on my discussion about anger one time, because there's this discussion point about like, people carry anger all the time, right? They're holding this kind of suppressed, like we're like holding on to it point. I feel like the stance about that is, because people are not thinking. They're just taking the emotion and not thinking through what this signifies. They got this phantasm of some arousal and not realizing that there's something deeper to it. But because the magnitude is so great, it's just acting upon them. That's what it feels like. Because they're so convinced that there's a and I stand by this. There's hidden amphetamines in the background that are activating that elation that's happening. Like there's a reason why you're getting so aroused in an anger. Because there's some major premise unspoken. You may not even realize you have it until the conflict shows up, and then you have it show up to you. I bring it up because as a friend, I actually remind on a personal level, a very close friend of mine is going through a very significant trouble with his marriage right now, and it's really and unfortunately it's spiraling into abuse, basically alcohol, substance abuse. And the pretense of everybody around him is a great sense of judgment because he's the breadwinner. So, and it's in point blank stated, you could cheat on your wife, you could do this drinking, but if you're not making money, you're not a man. And there's like this disdain, this air of disdain that's coming up from that. Because that it was great. I find it very interesting because I'm like observing this, talking to close family members about the situation, and a part of me is realizing I'm getting their amphetamines. Some of them are actually quite explicit now. Now the conflict is revealed. It showed the unspoken premise that they're operating on. It's quite interesting. So I'm gonna stop with that. I think that's quite interesting.
Well, you said a lot there that was very good, and I'll give it to Michelle and Mr. Luber. So there's something about anger where something comes out that was there, right? The unexamined premises, assumptions. There's this idea, as Pacia was saying, anger pushes up, anxiety pushes down. And you said something very interesting about trust, where trust has some sort of offloading, out, right? There's some sort of outgoing. One of the reasons I find trust so friggin' interesting is we almost mean the word to mean opposite things, in the sense of I offload thought to this thing so I don't have to think about it, right? Like culture and tradition. But then there's another sense in which I trust that of which I'm vulnerable to, right? Which vulnerability is an extreme creation of thought, right? Like if I'm vulnerable, I'm really at risk. So what's so interesting is we use the word trust, or trust practically functions almost in contradiction with itself, right? We trust that which we can rely on, but then we trust that which we're vulnerable to. Aren't those kind of opposites? Like, if you rely on it, you don't have to be vulnerable, right? You say, well, I'm vulnerable, but I can rely on them not to hurt me in that vulnerability or something, is what you're saying, right? Well, that's really weird, because then we use the word, like, that seems quite different than the trust in the culture, or the trust in the cup not to break, or to trust in the traffic to work, right? It's all on the same gradient. But as it advances into, say, the human, as Mr. Luber was saying, or empathy, it becomes almost opposite to itself, right? Like, when I trust in a human being, I'm trusting in that of which I really can't offload my thought to, right? Like, the moment I trust a person, that can be the ultimate activator of thought. And yet trust seems to be seeking to offload and, like, get away from, right? Or to not have to think about. But there's different kinds of trust. And it's interesting how you have this push up, push down, push out kind of logic that is an operation. And it's almost like what ends up happening is maybe there's something about thinking that is operating with the awareness of these different motions that are always occurring in your psyche. Like, okay, I am a being that will find myself pushing down. I am a being that will find myself pushing up, and I will find myself pushing out or putting on. What is the right ordering of that? What is the right way to go about that? What are the differences of that? And I think if you don't think about that, then it all becomes random. It all just comes spurting out at different times. And I think we're using words to describe directionalities of the psyche that we haven't, if I use the language of psyche, that we haven't thought about. And so then the way our mind manifests doesn't have direction, and certainly can't then be toward the teleological, the good, the beautiful, and the true. We just find ourselves pushed in directions because we haven't really thought about these different matters. There's more to say, but let me give it to Michelle. Michelle, please.
So I wanted to say, yeah, great topic. I mean, trust is of major interest to me, and it was, it's something that, like, I wrote. It was my first kind of quote unquote more like analytical type of essay to write on trust, because it's, it's always fascinating to me to think about how it's already part of the atmosphere in many ways, and yet we sort of think of earning trust. And yet, like, there's something to that, but at the same time, there's almost a way in which like Jockin was saying about this element of faith that goes into trust that almost seems more important, because otherwise you can kind of unintentionally harm the process of the cultivation of trust by demanding it in, like, this explicit manner. So just that really quick. But I was going to say, actually, the reason why I rose my hand was from something that Luber said when he was saying, like, you have to encounter the hot stove, right? That's the same kind of question I have had with negativity, like when in the Hegelian discussion of that, because it's almost like, okay, if negativity can be an opportunity to be sublative, then, well, maybe I should have tried cigarettes back in high school and become addicted to learn. Sorry, my headphone just turned off, but can you still hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, like, maybe I should have done that, because that would have been a negativity, and then I would be stronger for it. Never mind the fact that a lot of people who start smoking, like, can not kick that addiction, unfortunately, or that habit. So what the point of that is that it's saying, like, it's not simply the negativity or the encounter that you should just say, yes, I should be doing that, right? Like, that's not enough. It's not enough to say that the encounter or the negativity is going to be something that could be potentially sublative, right? Or, sorry, to be in Hegel, in the Hegel language, but that's what I'm familiar with that realm. But the point of the matter is, I think it has a lot more to do with, well, as we talked about, like, the maybe the barometer for that is often more like facing your fears, because, like, there are these, like, layers of negativity, right? There's layers of the potential for encounter. I mean, encounter and negativity as a parallel are not maybe the best, because they're different, and encounter has a lot to do with surprise. But actually, negativity in many ways is like that too, right? It's not the thing I'm going to crawl around on my knees because it's really hard and therefore I'm going to get stronger. No, it's I did not anticipate this being so difficult, right? And so there's an element of encountering that as a surprise that is the negativity you should be kind of hopefully enduring through and sublating through. Maybe not, maybe you'll face yourself or something through that. But anyway, so I just wanted to say that. And then the last thing on trust, I wanted to say that it is interesting to me how, I don't know, there's something about it where like we obviously have a whole lot that we do already trust because we just assume that the person's going to understand the words that we're using that are coming out of our mouths, right? Oh, hi puppies. The puppies are playing. Oh, you want to see the puppies, Grace? No. Oh my gosh. Luber trusted us enough to know how much we'd find that adorable. So thank you. Thanks for trusting us. But yeah, I guess I'm just thinking about like, why is it the case that we can know, and I don't know if it's actually related to the ontological element of trust, or if it's just the nature of language where we can say we trust, or we can learn stuff about trusting each other, and then yet we can still not. But I want to say that it does maybe have, like, this isn't the full answer to it, but I do wonder a lot of times if trust has a lot in others, and that cultivation of that has a lot more to do with what, well, you can only control certain, like yourself, really, ultimately, like, and certain things, right? Your actions, your behaviors, how you react and stuff. So to me, like the ultimate thing with trust is like, and maybe it sounds cheesy, I'm sure there's a lot of like, you know, the internet gurus saying this too about like trusting yourself, but there is this dimension where it does seem important to be able to have some sort of cultivation of self and trust in self. Not like, again, I feel bad to even say that because that can get so hijacked by just sort of like an egoic kind of pursuit or something. But what I mean to say is that like when you have that element of trust in yourself, it does go a long way. I do believe it can go a long way in trusting others around you, because ultimately you kind of also have this healthy, I don't trust you. it's I hope that makes sense, but it's this sort of I'm not going to rely on everybody else to make me happy, for example. So no, don't trust them with making you happy. That's actually not their job, you know? So I just wanted to bring that in there. But yeah, it could just be language itself too, where we hear things and we think we know them and we think we do them, but we just heard them or said them. So yes, anyways, I think it's an interesting topic. Thanks for showing us the doggies, Andrew. And yes, you guys are all very cool.
You're very cool, and I'll pass it to Luber. Clayton, you said a lot there. Well, first, there's something very interesting where we should be careful to assume trust is good, right? You can trust someone and be manipulated. Also, there's also something about trust where someone can say, you need to earn my trust. And the problem with that is they decide when you've earned it, so it's a power dynamic. And that doesn't seem to be actually a good thing, right? So there's that. There's also something where trust, I like what Luber was saying about relations, because the more you move, like it's one thing to talk about relations, entirely something else to talk about trust, right? It's cool to say there's ontological relations, but when I start saying ontological trust, oh, what the heck? I don't know what that even means. But if you're serious about relations, the higher the complexity, the more they're going to have the quality of something like trust versus, say, the relations between the flowers. Once you start moving to humans, you're actually, when you talk about relations, you are talking about something like trust and vulnerability. And relations are funny, right? Because people's happiest moments tend to be in relations, and also people's worst moments tend to be in relationships, right? So it would be very dangerous to say that relations are good or bad. And I think about that with negativity and encounterology. There's a sense in which, for me, it's not really like you say encounters are good or encounters are bad. It's more like they're inevitable. And the question is simply, will you be ready for them? Likewise, is it possible that you're an Amazon wolf boy who never has relations? Yeah, but the wolf boy did not seem to turn out so good. So it's pretty inevitable you're going to have relations, right? I think that's like incredibly likely you are going to be in relationships, right? So the question of are relationships good and bad is almost beside the point from their inevitability. But then the question is, what is one's conditioning of those relationships for their flourishing versus not, right? And more, it seems to me, nobody intends to have a bad relationship, and yet lots of people do. Nobody intends not to trust, and yet lots of people don't. So the things that must make the difference must be surprises. They must be things people encountered and aren't ready for. So when I talk about, I guess, surprises and counterology as an emphasis, It's more what I have in mind than saying surprise is always good or always bad. And I know no one's saying that. But for me, it's tied to its inevitability. And also, I personally am of the opinion, Ray Dalio in his book Principles, which is a tremendous book, he, I believe, talks about the difference between choices and decisions. And he says that we make tons of choices every single day. But in your life, you make like 6 decisions. And those decisions change everything, right? Like you actually make a very limited number of what he means by decision, meaning the entire course is different. You could actually view that maybe Mr. Luber at the Calzer in some respects. And so like for me, to emphasize encounterology is to emphasize the moments of decision that are distinct in quality from the great numerous amount of choices we make all the time between vanilla ice cream and chocolate ice cream. We then have the decision of say, and this is where I do think it seems to, decision and trust seem to go together because the moments of decision are risky. A lot of people in like the Harvard Business School emphasize vulnerability as being part of trust in organizations, right? Okay. Well, one of the reasons is because if you decide to be vulnerable, but then, of course, everyone thinks they are, and vulnerable becomes, I just tell you I think you suck, but I'm being vulnerable to the honesty of telling you that I think you did a bad job, so therefore I'm vulnerable, and people kind of pervert that in problematic ways, just like you were saying, Mr. Luber. So one has to expand on, well, this is, as a little note, and then I'll pass. This is why, actually, I think philosophy is kind of inevitable, because when you listen to a lot of, dare I say, TED Talks or different books that say vulnerability is important to leadership, well, what does that mean? How? The moment you ask how, now you're in Socrates. Crap. Like philosophy, I was telling Michelle this because I've been listening, because I've been working on this topic and like all these different TED Talks on trust. And a lot of business people, there can be a way where they say, oh, that's really practical, where philosophy is an abstract. To me, it's the exact opposite. Like a lot of these talks talk about vulnerability or like openness, and it sounds really practical. It strikes me as incredibly abstract, because what does it mean to be authentic? What does it mean to be vulnerable? How do you go about it? Nobody intends not to be authentic in a business. No one intends not to be trustworthy. Why? And yet they are, right? You end up in philosophy because it gets into the nitty gritty. Yet funny enough, by getting into the nitty gritty, then that seems abstract. When actually it's getting into the nitty gritty of how to do those things that you said were not abstract, but actually are, because they're ill-defined in their employment and their unfolding, right? It's kind of like, one of the ideas that we talk about differences of abstraction, I can make anything abstract by like getting really close to it. Like if I hold this really close to my face, it's now an abstract painting, but actually it's just because I'm really close to it, right? Or if I'm in an airplane looking down, everything looks like an abstract painting, right? And yet it's concrete, it's a city, right? So a lot of times I think what people call abstraction, like in philosophy, is actually just getting to the nitty gritty of what does it mean to be vulnerable? What does it mean to be authentic, right? And then it looks like it's abstract when actually it's just in the nitty gritty of what it would mean to actually do this in your personal life or business setting or different things. So it's a kind of interesting thing to me. But the point is, encounter and surprise is inevitable. These are moments of great decision, and what seems to be the quality of them is something like thinking in a trust way, in a way where you don't know what's necessarily going to occur, and yet you decide to give yourself over to that unfolding. You give yourself over to something, which is a trust act because it's outward versus inward, or it's an outward act, but it seems to be distinct in its existential quality, at least, versus giving yourself over that the ice cream cone won't collapse in your hand when you grab it, right? You could argue that's trust. I'm trusting that the ice cream cone won't fall apart when I grab it, but that seems very different from trusting in writing or trusting in, these kind of spaces. So anyway, let me give it to Mr. Luber Clayton and then Mr. Jockin. Mr. Luber, please.
I just sitting here while the dogs are playing, it like escalates to a certain point where it's like, okay, the dogs, I know my dog, for instance, he gets his ass beat at the end of the day. So at a certain point, what sometimes happens is there's trust, they're playing, and then Levi, the bigger dog, will bite really hard on the neck. Hyde will signal like, and then he lets go. He just knows. So this is just something that I'm like observing in real time that I just wanted to say out loud. But basically, like, there seems to be this like implicit buying into the unfolding of what's happening. That's just intuitive to a degree. So from that perspective, I agree with like you making the claim at the basis, at the nucleus of ontology is trust. And from an using like an existential word, trust. That's typically how it's used. I agree with that. Now, I just want to like bask in this moment because there's things that I actually disagree with that like Jockin was saying, and it's been so long, it feels like I can't even remember when. So this is just like, I just sitting in it for a second. Anyway, so, okay. If you were to say like you trust, like people trust their thinking, I would say, I don't think they're thinking. What their trust is toward isn't actually thinking, because if you think about what thinking is, it's inherently not trusting. It's actually like the opposite, where it's like, oh, you have this notion. There's something about that notion that isn't sitting well to the point where you have to interrogate that notion. And at the moment of interrogation, that's actually when you start thinking. So it's actually an unfolding of distrust, but like from a like almost like a Heideggerian like disclosure point of view, where you're just like always already disclosed to just being, and you're already you're already in a moment of standing out. So there's a certain trust of standing out in being where you're already in. But like in the midst of that, what actually keeps you going from standing out in being is actually not trusting. Like what actually keeps you in the unfolding of standing out and being is ironically the opposite thing to the primordial cause, which is trust, if you made the ontological claim. So I think depending on the lens you're looking at it, from a more existential standpoint, which is where I think thinking occurs in, like in that dimension more, you're in a constant state of distrust more so, and like ontologically always already in a state of being in trust itself, if that makes sense. Now where I think it gets, where the line crosses over, where it becomes very hard to distinguish, is in empathy, in the comment that I was saying, because in empathy, you're like penetrating how the other person is, in their own way, ontologically, like standing out in being. And while at the same time, it's coming from your positionality of standing out in being. So it's like in your existential, in your state of distrust, you're actually having access to another person's ontological status of trust, even though both parties are in a constant state of distrust. There's a moment of like releasement in that in that like disclosure of trust, where you see how the other person in a certain sense is seeing how they're standing out. So like sorry if the dogs are too loud, they're going crazy right now. I gotta walk away, it was distracting me. Sorry. So it's a certain like we were saying already, like it's a certain vulnerability that allows you to almost be beyond your like existential state of not trusting. And that to me requires like faith, because you can't reason your way to it. And that to me is just like Kant. And I know we don't like Kant, but for that reason, a little part of me will always like Kant, because it kind of started, for me at least, with him showing me that a little bit. then and then the last thing is like, okay, if you were to situate trust in how one, okay, so like someone will be on a journey, let's just call it a story of like understanding how a concept is a universal. Like every philosopher in my mind kind of has that journey where they like see a dichotomy that makes up a concept, and then through breaking down that dichotomy, they like get to the place where that concept is a universal, where both sides of the dichotomy and the concept kind of collapse into one, and at that point, it's the universal, right? There's a certain trust where it's like you're investigating what this concept is, but like in the midst of investigating that concept, you're breaking down the dichotomy. You're like saying in a certain sense, like, I don't trust this dichotomy that makes up this concept. And then ironically, the end result is that you like trust the concept as the universal and not the particular dichotomy. So it like sublates into that. I wonder if that is phenomenologically objective. Like that story, so to speak, where it's like you, how things appear to you is essentially like this is like the breaking down of a dichotomy in real time. And like what you're left with, the appearance, is that like in the moment, like you just see it as like an unambiguous object. Basically, it's like completely unambiguous. It just is what it is, which in a certain sense is akin to like the concept being like the understanding it as a universal without dichotomy. I hope that if I can explain more of that last part if that didn't make sense, if anyone's interested. But yeah, I'm just curious if like there's okay, the point is in investigating life from a place of ontology is trust. I think you get to this place where you like see how irony moves, and then I wonder if from there you can kind of make a general claim of this is how things in general are cohesive to us or intelligible, whatever. That I guess that's what I was just thinking about. So I just wanted to say that. But
no, outstanding. And actually, it's funny because I'm now thinking about the word investigate, which is kind of weird because it's invest, like you're stable, but investigate means you look around. So it's kind of interesting how you're investigating what to invest in. And there seems to be something, what I'm interested in is it almost seems as if there is always a pre-question of what is thought, what is trust before the thought. Like, because there's one sense in which, I think it's true that people basically never question their thoughts, which in a sense means they never think. It's that always already, like once you question, well, how do I know? Then it's as if you're thinking for the first time. In a sense, you could say most people are in a kind of pre-thought that's not thought because they never questioned it. Luber, please.
Sorry, real quick. I think it's kind of akin to the conversation we had a week ago about the pre-talk, where like what's happening is that you're in a state of like trust. So like the question of trust, it doesn't even appear to you. Yeah. So yeah, just that when the thought happens, that's because trust is in question, and that's why the thought is occurring.
Yep.
But like, I just wanted to say that doesn't mean that even though you're in that you're investigating that lack of trust, it's a lack. There's no trust like that. I just wanted to make that clear. That's all. But,
well, that's exactly right. There's a weird, like, what is the space between trust and not trusting that isn't trust, but also not trusting? What are you doing in that space? What is that suspension that is a holding? And what's very interesting is there seems to be, I think and I'll give it to Clayton and Mr. Jockin, we tend to associate thinking with searching for truth, right? And kind of the opposite of thinking or bad thinking is falsity. But what's suggested here is actually thinking is always, it's almost like thinking is more dialectically relating with trusting than it is falsity, if you will, right? Like we tend to associate truth and false, and we say, oh, thinking is about truth, right? Well, yeah, of course. But what's interesting is it's almost like thinking is an action of a kind of warming up to or warming in, incubating a moment where then you trust, right? Because that's another thing that's interesting about trust. Like, I don't think most people say, I will start trusting now. You just find yourself trusting, right? Likewise, there's some moment where you've investigated the bookcase and explored it, and then suddenly, okay, that's it. You kind of trust it as what you found it to be, even if you're wrong, right? You just suddenly stop. Like, what's interesting too about this relation between thinking and trust, if you trust it, why are you thinking about it, right? What's there to think about? You trust it, right? And yet, if you don't think about it, on what grounds do you trust it, and what are you trusting? So the two things that seem to require one another eat one another, or they seem to exist in some sort of contradiction with one another, right? And so this would suggest a reason, like once you kind of break it, it's almost like Wittgenstein talking about, you know, rebuilding a spider web with your bare hands is restoring a tradition. Like once trust is, like once you've shattered the view of the world you trusted in, then you have to put it back together with the very thinking that broke it, right? So how can thinking of which broke the thing you trusted in get you back to something you trust in without breaking it again, right? You've started some sort of endless process, right? So what in that process of thinking, what is the moment when the trust emerges? Almost like being, I want to almost say, it just shines out. Suddenly the trust is there. And it's almost like, and then I'll give it to Clayton, it's almost like thinking is a process of incubating, warming yourself up to, getting comfortable with a certain trust in. That is mysterious in its appearance, and so you can't stop thinking. You just have to keep thinking, you have to keep doing the faithful presence, you keep having to do the work, because the moment when the stabilization appears is kind of mysterious. You know, there's a certain surprising quality to it. And yet that gives you reason to think about it some more, because it does appear so mysteriously. So then you just destabilize it again. But the point is, there's something about thinking that is the work of trying to create the conditions where this thing of trust kind of appears almost. This thing kind of emerges again, almost like tilling the ground and then a flower comes up. I'm not sure, but let me give it to Clayton here. Clayton, it is wonderful to have you here this evening, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And it's really great to be here today. Very interesting subject with trust. And yeah, what it's bringing back for me is like when we moved to Australia like a few years back. Having moved here from Uganda was a bit like we experienced something strange, which is kind of what you guys are sort of intimating towards. I don't know if it's the same in America, but anyways, what we discovered was there's a very high degree of trust in this, you'd say, society. And eventually, after sort of ruminating on it a few years, what I came to the conclusion for now is that it seems as if the modality is you get given trust by default until you prove unworthy of it. And then there's all these mechanisms put in place to manage sort of like this disruption of this trustful way of being, which is quite different from, you know, back in Uganda where I came from. Like the system is a bit different. There's very low trust. In fact, we had this saying of which I sort of like, I'm trying to find a different way of using it now, but there was this whole assumption and expectation of like you have to untrust. So you always have to prove that you're trustworthy. So you in every situation you're presenting yourself, um, trying to like really justify that you can't be trusted, for whatever aim that you're working towards. Um, but I found that to be different here in Australia because it's not really like the way of being is not really about the justification for the trust. Like, you say, I do this, or like I'm gonna buy that thing, and so your word is taken as that's it. That whatever you say, that's the truth, that's the reality. We're just gonna work with the way you've presented. And working across systems, you go like, oh wait, I presented that because I had this other aim, right? It's not really what I may be presenting if I had a different aim, but for the aim that I was working towards at the moment, this is what I had to present because that's the system we come from. And then you find, oh no, it's a bit different. Here, the assumption is whatever you present, that is it until you prove unworthy of the trust. And even when the trust is withdrawn from you, there's a whole allowance in there of like, yeah, maybe you made a mistake. Maybe, we should be gentle about this. Like, well, where I come from, it's like, oh, okay, if you're not trustworthy, it's like, yeah, ostracize that person, cut them off, kick them out, never deal with them again because they cannot be trusted in the slightest bit. Um, and so what that sort of like brings to mind for me is like, how do collectivist cultures and individualistic cultures, how do they deal with this whole issue of trust? And what I'm noticing of late is it's kind of like in collectivist culture, the the objective is, for the collective. It's like, look, just be like everyone else, fit in and follow the rules, and we'll all be fine as a group because uh, we want to succeed as a group. And if you are doing that, if you are following the rules, if you are fitting in, then you can be trusted. And if you start to self-express, that's a problem because I don't know if we can trust you. Like you're not following the rules, you're not fitting in, you're being strange. What do we do with this, right? Uh, while in like individualistic culture, and when I say individualistic culture, I'm talking more about like the westernized way of being, where people really there's a larger overarching system, but within it, you kind of like just an individual. You're allowed to self-express, and so in individualistic it's a culture. What I'm finding is your self-expression. That is how you're trying to demonstrate your trustworthiness, your authenticity. It's like, can't you trust me? Like, look, I am being really real. I like soy milk. I know not everybody likes it, but that's what I like. And you should trust me because I have revealed to you my preference. And now, uh, yeah, trust me. It's like I'm telling you my preference so you can trust me. And so and so yet where I come from, it's like if you reveal that, it's like we don't really care. There's just one category of milk, and here's what we're giving you. You either use that. If you don't like it, that's your business. Go figure it out. But over here, it's like, oh, you like soy milk? Okay. I knew, a few other people who like soy milk. Maybe we could start a business that sort of, caters to that niche. And so it's sort of like that freedom allows for like the pluralism to kind of like increase and everybody come together, play together. But in the other setup, it's more like the uniqueness is more like with the group, and it's like no, fit in, let's grow as a group, let's be more dominant because of that shared identity. um anyhow, those are some of the thoughts and that are coming up with this subject. Yeah, thank you. I don't know what you guys think about them.
No, that's outstanding, and I agree with Mr. Jockin that that T-shirt freaking rocks. And you know, I like soy milk. I like carrot milk. You know, carrot juice. So trust me. But actually, that's a really very important point. There is something. One of the reasons why trust interests me is because carrot juice, this really weird orange stuff that's supposed to be good for your eyes. I don't know if it actually is. I just heard it once. You know, and trusted the liars on the advertisement board. So you know. But anyway, but what's very interesting about trust is it's almost this space where no matter how business minded, practical minded, social economic minded you are, you have to admit that there's something important about this. And so you can't, and yet it's squishy and abstract and difficult, right? It's like an in for philosophy, if you will. It's like, because business cultures are obsessed with trust, right? Like, how do we create trust? And no matter how much GDP or how much wealth they have or how much money they create, they can still be like, we have no idea what to do about trust. And we know it matters because we're losing hires. People don't want to work for us. They're falling out and we're losing them, right? So it's interesting because this kind of squishy thing, this it's clear trust and culture are almost two sides of the same coin. And you can't systemize culture, and yet it matters. So it forces the hardcore business pragmatist or whoever to acknowledge something beyond their scope of what they think matters. Right? It has this way of kind of saying there's another horizon beyond what you typically value that needs to be acknowledged. And actually, it's extremely consequential if you don't, right? So that's interesting to me. You also said that societies have different ideas of trust. And this is also, I think, really important. There is lots of studies that show, for example, that high trust societies tend to have higher GDPs, more entrepreneurship. You don't tend to have entrepreneurship if you have low trust. And a high trust society basically starts off assuming trust until you break it, where a low trust society is one that you have to earn trust. But of course, the problem with earning trust is there's always reason not to give it. No different than skepticism. There's always, this is another reason, okay, like literally the characteristics of trust and thought are incredibly similar. Like, when do you think you're noting, like, I only give trust when I have a syllogism and logic, right? Okay, you're supposed to think as a math problem, 2 + 2 = 4. Don't give me any of that poetry, literature stuff. Just give me the formulaic thought, right? Likewise, people with trust, they're like, you did this, you did this, you did this. Therefore, I can trust you, right? Versus just, no, I trust you until you break it, right? But then isn't it interesting, once it's broke, it's so hard to bring back. Like, there's entire agencies on the question of bringing back truth. Well, likewise, once you stop believing in everything, once your religion is broke, once your truth is gone, then it's really hard to get out of nihilism, right? So there's something, there's something where trust is like the social manifestation of the social idea. Like, whatever the idea of the society is manifest in its logic of trust, which necessarily has practical impact. So this is interesting because trust seems to be the linchpin between idea and practice, right? Like, it's the space between them that links them, right? A society's idea of trust, which all practice requires, especially if it's collective, is based on its ideas, right? Of what is, is the human a collective being or an individual being, right? Like, based on that, you determine if they're matching the idea, and therefore if they give them trust. Therefore, your definition of what the human is and what is best for the human translates into what you trust, which translates into practice, right? And where does that idea of what the human is come from? But, well, philosophy, right? So there's something about idea, trust, practice. They lead into one another, right? And they feed into one another. And I think, I mean, look, that's one of the, like, I've listened to a lot of people, like, if I were to tell you what the metadata is on many studies on trust, the three recurring, one idea that keeps coming up is be authentic, okay? Like, be someone who, when people talk to you, they trust you. They don't think you're lying. They don't think you're hiding. They don't think you're being fake, right? Here's the problem. That seems self-evident in what it means. And this is why I'm saying that a lot of this kind of TED Talk stuff needs to get to philosophy. Not that I hate TED Talk. I'm not bashing TED Talk. I'm just saying that I think we try to avoid philosophy, but if you actually look at things, you end up over there. It's because in the West, being authentic is saying, I like soy milk. But someone else may be like, wow, I can't trust them with secrets because they just tell everyone everything. So I can't trust them. Also, every time they're having a bad day, they tell me, so I can't trust them to not weigh down the whole organization with their emotional well-being. So I can't trust them. But in their mind, they're being vulnerable, being authentic, therefore can be trusted, right? So there's the problem is the word authentic in America will be very different than, say, other civilizations, right? But when you're giving a TED Talk, you say, well, business leaders just need to be authentic and they need to be empathetic. What is empathetic? Like, what does it mean to be empathetic, right? Like, I need to try to understand your worldview. Well, when do I know that I have succeeded in that versus started assuming, right? It's not self-evident. I'll be like, no, I'm being empathetic. I know that you like carrot juice because your mom made you drink it when you were young. No, she didn't. I just genuinely like it. You just started assuming things from, when does empathy transition into that, right? It's not obvious unless you start thinking, right? So I really like that example because I definitely think that trust seems to reflect the social coordination of the social idea or the social identity, right? And different societies, different businesses have different notions of what that means. But that means there's something, if there's like, it's like trust and different ways of being human, different ways of organization go together. And trust forces a realization of the necessity of the idea. Like, you have to deal with the idea. To say something with big marks, like double apostrophes around it or something. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please.
Okay, very good. So I have replies to make. Let's start with, we're first with Luber. So Luber, I put a comment in the chat about, I'll explain what I mean. So first I'm going to make a distinction between the use of thought, right, to operate on just expressing emotion, like as I talked through, right, with Daniel in that first reply. What Luber's objection was about was this idea of this distrust in thought because you're thinking about your thinking and all that, but what's not, et cetera, right? And then it's kind of operation on itself contradictorily. But the one thing I've interjected, that's called reflection, right? So that's, in terms of a concept, that's called, as a naming of a kind of thought process, that's reflection as opposed to working with phantasms. The phantasms are abstractions in our minds we use in our operations of thought, but can also cause activation of the will, of the imagination, of memory, and the irascible and the communicable appetite. All things can be elicited by the phantasms. So that's the point. It's like when you're getting exposed to stimulus from the outside, it's the phantasms in reality from a scholastic point of view that's causing you to get elated in different states and ways. It's not like you're getting direct connection from the sensation. There's an abstraction going on in thought, in the operation of the mind automatically, from the common sense from Aristotle, from all the sensation data and being converted into a phantasm. I'm going to circle back on that in a second. That's different from reflection. Reflection is the activation of the thought on the thought, right? So Daniel brought that up. But I want to point something out very important about that. This is always the great crux of it. You're doing this thought in your thought because you actually believe you're thinking about it's going to solve the problem. Isn't this exactly the great problem of obsession, of neuroticism, of all these other of these conditions? You actually believe, you truly believe that the thought activity of trust me, listen, I guarantee everyone in this room right now is guilty of this. They think if we just think harder about this, we're going to crack it. We're going to solve the problem. Trust me, I've been there. And I'll tell you what, my therapist I had a really rough patch at one point. My therapist, God bless his soul, point blank said that to me. And you would know what he did? And actually it was very interesting. I wasn't aware I was doing it. I was using all this metaphorical imagery of the courtroom, of being a petitioner to a judge. I was doing it just naturally, just flowing out of me, that statement of language. And my therapist, I think, picked it up and he worked with me. He actually took that language, that imagery, and worked with it. You know what eventually caused me to finally rest the mind? I kept spiraling about this imagery, right? And working through this thought, kind of neurotic, obsessional thought process. What finally gave me rest was a new image. It wasn't thought. It's an image, because that's the distinction I'm using from Aquinas. The difference between having a principle. That's part of like when you have so Daniel, your comment about resting that state of rest from you look at the bookshelf, you know the bookshelf, because you believe you have trust of the principle of what a bookshelf is, right? That thus you can trust it because you know you have possession of the principle of what it is to be a bookshelf. It's the aletheia. It's the Heideggerian stance of aletheia, in the sense that you have the opening, right? The awareness of the opening of it, of the entity. It's only in the rest of a new image that I was cured of that obsessional state. So I just want to kind of reflect. I'm sure Luber's going to contest that, but I just want to point out, like, that's what I'm getting at, because I just find that so incriminating. It's just like, and my therapist said it to me. He's like, Thomas, you think if you just thought hard enough, you would come to the revelation and you would just solve the problem that you're in. You would find some magical solution to this untenable problem you're in. I was absolutely guilty of that, 100%. And also, by the way, and it's now so funny, we actually do have a real problem. You know, the whole idea of, like, sometimes it's actually the best solution is to stop thinking about it so you can go for a walk. Take your mind off the topic. Go do something else. Go work out, go for a hike, go do something else. And then those are your stories of eureka moments. You're on the highway, all of a sudden it snaps and you get the understanding on the spot. It's not for that, it's just like that full attack of the mind on itself to try to force an answer. I think about that a lot. Because I think that's a very important detail. Because that's the thing, we're just so self-deceived. We think by thinking we're going to solve our problems. And it's a great place for that thing. It has a great place as part of being a human being. But when we think it's the end-all be-all, that doesn't work. Partly because the things we don't realize, well, one is that we don't realize that the human being has all these like the fact that how memory and the common power, the common sense and the estimation power actually operate on us. The original point about, like, can I trust you as a human being? A lot of that is just basically the estimation power of assessment. Are you a benefit or harm? That's actually the level of operation going on. And by the way, part of that, and I was going to comment, now I have to make an objection to Daniel about this notion of the idea in trust and high trust societies. Is it not also the case that these are also societies that have very strong governments that force the mandate, the honoring of contracts, the protection of private property? They set up what's happened, we've offloaded trust to a third party called the government, the Leviathan. We've sacrificed some freedoms in exchange for the trust mechanism, allowing us because it would require incredible bravery if we didn't have that. But the point is that the Joe Schmo with no virtue can trust, because they know if there's a conflict, I can sue you and get my damages returned, for example. And then, by the way, the idea of, like, a strong government presence and police and all that if someone broke into my house, they would do something about it, right? Michelle, good to see you. I do think that's an important caveat about this. And it's related to ideas, because it is an idea about the nature of governance with citizens and the commons. Like, I think that's an important, so it is idea related. I'm not disagreeing with that. I just think that's an important element, actually showing how we handle trust. Sometimes it is delegated outside. This is the whole argument of crypto, right? With the blockchain. The whole argument was that we'll offload trust because it will be handled by an autonomous entity that will handle this for us. I don't have to know you. I can just trust the ledger to give a recording of it. So I just want to chew on that for a minute. But by the way, this note about authenticity in corporate culture, isn't it? It's just so annoying, because it's this air of just be yourself, this pure creativity and just uniqueness. And yet it's always the same kind. Like, I like almond milk and I go for hikes and I go rock climbing. It's like those memes of, like, it's like those memes when you go on dates and it's basically you could just get the other person just asks a question, then repeats back what you're going to say, because they already know the archetype that you're under, the category. It's like we have this pretension of uniqueness, but in reality, we're all the same. We're all unique. We're all uniquely the same. And then actually, the worst one is when like we just normalize trauma dumping. It's like, that's how we're going to know each other. Which is disgusting. It actually really is, because what that does is it actually takes the most intimate, deepest parts of people's reality that This is why I've always said part of real intimacy is actually secrets. It actually is very important. Not everything needs to be transparently put out there to all peoples at all times. Part of the act of intimacy is having deep, dark secrets that only certain people get access to, just like access to the body, right? In terms of certain people, like part of intimacy that only you as my beloved have access to my body, and just like you as my beloved have access to these deep, dark secrets about my soul, right? When we just like you go in on a 9-to-5 job and they go on the onboarding, you get told that your introduction to the trauma dump episode. And I've seen TikToks where they do their trauma dump, they put candy in a bowl. It's just like, this is how we socialize with each other. It's a very bizarre scenario. But that's the part I just find very annoying. But I think the part that I think is quite interesting, and it's fair, I think which is actually a spiritual practice. It's the idea of, which again has been memified like crazy with Gen Z and TikTok with Riz charisma. So what that is, its original meaning was the shining forth, that there was not duplicity. See, that's the key. So when people say authenticity, what they want is they want lack of duplicity, where simulation, actually Aquinas' language, simulation is not occurring, where you're presenting to me one thing, but in reality, you're something completely different. And in the business relationship. So the point is, I'm reminded of the idea of the polytropic from Lesser Hippias, because the big question was, who was the better man, Achilles or Odysseus? And the main argument made was that this is the present argumentation. It was better. The better man was the one who lied with intention versus the one who didn't, who lied accidentally. It's very fun. It's a full spin around. Now it's very important because it points out it's about the idea that people of virtue have choice to do evil, but choose not to. They can do bad things, but they choose not to because they have a full range of passability, versus the bad person only has access to the one power. That's Aristotle's reading of that, interpretation of it. But in this case, what we're talking about here is that idea of when we almost don't hold people accountable, like the real description adjective for it, but the card salesman that just has no interests except himself, in a kind of real authenticity, like he really is only interested about himself, and he's fully transparent about that fact, and he's here to get the sale, and that's what he cares about. And he won't do wrong. He will honor the law, and he will not deceive you, but he is absolutely interested in his own self-interest, and he's letting that be known. There's almost a sense of respect for that. It's like, I don't like you, but I respect you, because at least I know what I'm getting out of you. Versus the guy who says, I'm your best friend. I'm watching out for your best interest. No, you're not. The fuck? Like, no, you're not. I'm watching for your interest. Don't insult my intelligence. Like, see that dynamic. So authenticity is about a kind of clarity of intent. And that's kind of the key part. And that's the point. Like, listen, but that's the thing too. Is also like, I'm not here to be your best friend. So I don't care about your interest in oat milk. Like, I don't care. I'm here to buy a car. Now, I respect you if you can talk about the car and how, and what the financing of it and the work and the mechanics of it. That's awesome. Great. I appreciate those qualities about you. That's fantastic. I don't care about the fact like almond milk or what you had an egg sandwich this morning. You can maybe talk about it as a quick offhand comment, just because you're like, it's not necessarily identifying oneself. It's just straight up, just like, I'm just living, and this is not even an issue for me. Like, I'm moving forward, and I'm not in any hesitation. There's no hesitation. It's right. Actually, it's very similar to don't be in your head, right? So kind of build on that part. It's like the problem of you can't be social when you're in your head. It's kind of, but these are all very Western dynamics, because it's Clayton pointed out. Clearly, this is a very different dynamic when you're very strong social bond societies, where the real attribution is what clan you're in, what tribe you're in, or what grouping are you part of, and do you belong in that group? And by the way, we still have elements of that in the West. Basically, for example, if you're part of an elite school and say you're an alumni of that school, you instantly get more. People are going to take you more. They're going to trust you because of your group association. So we do it all the time. We still have it. Or you went to this school. You're a former employee at this company. You don't even know that person personally, just because they're a part of that group association. There's a trust built from that. So, and then just that's the point. Then a really interesting one, and I've had this happen myself. I'll close on this because I'm just kind of meandering at this point. is when I was traveling, I was away from New York, and I happened to run into at a bar. I was at a bar with a friend, with friends, a fellow Long Islander. We actually went to the same high school. Did not know him, but he went different years than me. That sense of like, I knew, like it was an instant, like, oh, he's my people. That's the estimated power, by the way. That's what that is. It's basically saying, oh, you're not like they give the equivalency that's used. When a sheep sees another sheep in his flock, he goes, oh, you're good with me. We're good. Versus a wolf, who goes, oh, that's not what I want. I don't want to be near that. That kind of coming closer and running away from. That's pure biology. Like that's the estimated power operating at that moment. Because factually, there is no reason to trust this individual. None. The only thing I found out was where he says he's from the same geographic location. What? But that's actually an example of trusting. Like that is absolutely. And by like, I had that once I had that association, the thinking just went right through. There was no thinking about the thinking. It was just operating through going trust. But the part reason why I can do that because that, and even in a low trust society, that would be the case. If you said you were from this town and you're from this family, that would activate the trust instantaneously. It would probably activate the trust very quickly. So there's something about these group associations and their power of trust generation related to the estimation of benefit and harm operation that's going on here. It's quite interesting.
No, magnificent. I think that idea of this, I recognize them, therefore I can trust them because I see myself in them to some degree, or I have a sense of their world. So I have a sense of how they handle things, therefore I can trust them. And more, I associate, there's something about trust that is ultimately based on the handling of reality. How the person handles reality is the kind of phrase that keeps coming up for me. Because if I can tell you I did something wrong at work and you won't yell at me, then I believe you can handle reality, right? You don't have trust at work if nobody feels like they can talk to the boss without risking their job, right? So the boss can't handle reality, right? There's another way in which if I think when they talk about vulnerability, which again, this is a problem with a lot of, dare I say, business conference speeches, is because, well, that the unintended consequences of that could be trauma dumping, right? And Mausik's book on the importance of secrecy for intimacy, right? That's not there. But this is why, like, again, you end up in philosophy, Michelle and I talk about this all the time. You don't end up in philosophy because you wanted to. You saw no other way. You had to go there because once you start asking, well, what are you vulnerable about? Bam, then you're all the way to asking, what is the meaning of life? Like literally asking like little questions like that. It's like, well, what does it mean to be human? Like you just end up there. You almost have to, just by how things link together. So there's this way too where when you trust someone to fix the car because they can handle the reality of the car, right? You trust someone to tell you, like, you trust if you're having a bad day or you're not happy with the work climate, you trust that I can tell you without getting blown up. But also there's another side to this where if I really want to play with the idea, handling reality is someone who also knows that just because they feel like work sucks doesn't mean work actually sucks, because that is reality. They don't actually know that. They just feel that, right? But there's the reality of the feeling, but it's not actually a reality that the feeling equals the reality, the truth, right? So there's something about trust that is tied to an estimation of how the people around you handle reality and how you handle reality. And actually, it's about getting at reality somehow. The issue is that reality changes based on the people involved in it. It's not self-evident what it is, and we can get it wrong, right? But there's some trying to get at it. And I think that's why people also associate trust with transparency, because if nobody's transparent, we can't know the reality, let alone handle it. And it's interesting because an environment of trust feels kind of like magic in one sense. It feels like people are able to handle reality and make things work, right? And so there's something there. I'm also quite interested on what you were saying with the obsession, because it's almost like you're constantly trying to keep thought and trust at a certain relation, and in the obsession they collapse into one another. You're trusting in the thought, right? When actually you're supposed to think in relation to a trust. But then if they're too far apart, then that's problematic because you're trying to find facts to replace ever having to trust, and you're also putting maybe trust over here in the personal and not in the intellectual, when really there's some sort of mean, to use that language, between the relation of trust and thinking that you have to use thinking and trust to figure out, right? So that seems like you're done. Well, that's where perhaps that new image is important, right? Like if you can't figure it out, then the non-rational, okay, the encounter, the surprise, the thing outside of the dialectic between those, if you will, right? That's where the like that's where you introduce the third, and that in of itself can help you assess the relation between the two, right? But if you don't have the third, you may be doomed to either collapse them and thus end in that cycle, or pull them apart and never learn to trust, because all you ever do is use thinking to find the facts. And so you think you can trust, but really you're outsourcing it. And that point you were saying about outsourcing is really important. I'm really glad what you were saying on the institutions, because so the guys who just won the economy, the Nobel Prize, they wrote a book on the question of where does prosperity come from. And one of the things they talk about is trust in institutions. You cannot have a high trust society without institutions, right? And institutions are critical for entrepreneurship, creativity. And actually, it was the first time I've seen people talking about Robert Solow in a very long time, because I think the Solow residual, which is the mystery of, once you account for liquidity and prosperity, there's like 50%, 35 to 50% of GDP you can't account for. Really, it's called the residual. It's like, so what is it? He's like, well, it's creativity. What's that? Because it apparently matters, right? And it's like, well, we don't really know. Well, that's funny, because that means 35 to 50% of our discipline is a mystery. Yeah. So these guys come along and they say, well, we know the answer, ladies and gentlemen. It's institutions. If you have strong institutions, people feel safe. And once they're safe, they're creative and the right brain gets going, right? Now, I'm not necessarily against that, but I think you pointed at something really, really important. Institutions create a kind of trust, but it's actually an outsourced trust, which actually means you had to have started with an inward trust, then moved outward. This is why I greatly prefer, because as you know, my big argument, as we've talked about many times, is that economics cannot explain the creation of demand. Like demand is this mysterious thing that they just act like is there. A reason why I resist the argument of saying that all you need for creativity is institutions is because you're skipping a step. You're saying, like, how did those get there? And that's why I like the work of Dr. Kahn, who actually links together trust, creativity, and entrepreneurship, because he asked the following question. How do you get growth in a developing nation, though, that doesn't have strong institutions or anything? And his answer, after studying, is basically, it's something like this. The entrepreneur is central, which I agree with. It's all about the creativity, not simply the stimulation of demand. I'll give it to Luber here. But the entrepreneur, pre-institutions, has to do two things. They have to create a product, but then also create the conditions of people to trust so that they have the environment for it. So they have to wear two hats. Another way to put it, Dr. Cohn says they have to create the conditions to create. So they have to create a good, but also simultaneously work to create the social environment that people can trust one another to thus participate in entrepreneurship or buy the goods. And, a lot of people look at Dr. Cohn's work and say, K-H-A-N-A. They say, wow, you're putting a whole lot of weight on the entrepreneur. You're saying they literally have to do the work of creating social trust while also creating a product that the society needs? Yes, they need to do both at the same time. But actually, is that not? And I think he's right, because the problem is these new economic analysis assume the the institution is an outsourced trust. That's only going to emerge. And actually, the problem, well, are we not seeing this? If the institutions fail, there's no real trust. It was all a kind of illusion in a sense. And so then wealth collapses into the great stagnation. So I strongly think there are different kinds of trusts, if you will. And what ends up happening is the very success of a more human-driven trust, if you grant me that, to create the institutions then becomes a threat to that very human-driven trust that then sets you up to fail in the same way that the creation of demand creates the conditions to destroy demand, as we talked about before, right? So likewise, the social conditions of trust create the possibility of the institutions you outsource to and then you can't trust. And then if they fail, you're going to lose the creation of demand because you do have to have trust in yourself you have to trust that over the entrepreneurship. basically entrepreneurship is only possible if people can trust in the next 10 years. Like if they can assume they've got 10 years, then you've got some possibilities. But this all means, like, again, if there's something about like philosophers, when you're really thinking, are not merely thinking thought, but the conditions of thought itself. Like real thinking is bound up with the conditions of the thinking that you're thinking. That is isomorphic to the truth of economics, which the basis of economics and society is the kinds of individuals that are not only making the thing, but also creating the conditions that can receive the thing, right? And you say, well, that sounds impossible. Well, that's why, like, thought in this deeper sense, reflection, like you said, like actual philosophical movement toward the beautiful or actual creation of demand or wealth is so freaking rare because it requires this taking the way that Dr. Kahn put it that I liked is he said, you just have to, as the entrepreneur in a developing nation, and in general, you have to take not only responsibility for your business, but for the conditions of trust the society needs to receive your business. Like you have to internalize that double effort. And you say, well, that's not fair, but it's the only possibility. Mr. Jockin.
I just want to add to that. So when, for example, when restaurants like fast food restaurants started developing, I remember this from White Castle. There was this huge issue of cleanliness. The reason why White Castle had all this emphasis of white and the reason why the cooks cooked in the open and wore the attire that they did, this was emphasis, and like no one had beards, for example, was because of exactly that point. They needed to build trust and basically cleanliness. So I just want to build on that point.
Well, that's a tremendous example. And, I really like Dr. And for me, I just, not to be conspiratorial, but I think sometimes like the Nobel Prize goes to books that kind of match the agenda of the people. And it's lovely to think, yeah, we need institutions. So, people stop with your popularism and have support in these institutions. I was like, okay, Nobel Prize people, okay. But really, Dr. Cohn at Harvard, he's really pointing out, he's like, well, where do the institutions come from, dang it? Like it has to be like, I think that White Castle example is actually brilliant because that's what is the entrepreneur doing in that example, the business owner. They are taking responsibility for the signaling while they're doing the product. But this also means the language I would want to say to Dr. Like I'd say you need to, what you're moving now is almost into architecture and design, are you not? Like this, I do think actually, Christopher Alexander, your work, like because there's an architectural principle, that a geometrical principle even, that's at the root, that's at the basis that you can't get stuff off the ground unless you start there. Mr. Jockin.
I'm sorry to just pile in on this point. It's called cultural information. So the point is that information, like basically artifacts and products have also cultural information embedded in it. Designers work on that. And it's basically designed for embed cultural information to help build basically communicate cultural belonging, sense of position, and things like basically these conditions of trust. As you're bringing up.
No, that's brilliant because basically what Dr. Cohn is saying is that a society that doesn't have institutions now has a chicken and egg problem and will never get off the ground, right? Unless the entrepreneurs take responsibility for their product and the cultural information. And they see the cultural information as the creating of the environment of trust from which then you can get stuff off the ground, right? Like there's this weird problem in economics where going from 0 to 1 is way freaking harder than going from 1 to 2, right? Like once you go from 0 to 1, okay, well now we can build the public schools, you start having a much more linear path, right? But the great mystery, in my opinion, of economics is going from 0 to 1. And all these freaking books are acting like it just takes care of itself. And it doesn't. It freaking doesn't. And it has something to do with this double action. That's at the root of things. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, play. And then if anyone has final things. Oh, he's been killed by the dogs. I'm sorry, Mr. Luber. They got him. I'm sorry, Mr. Luber. Yeah, Mr. Jockin, please.
Well, while I'm waiting for Luber to come back, I'm going to give you the other example. So notice that basically post-COVID, pharmacies, CVSs and whatnot, all of a sudden having to shelving barriers, lock up all their products. That's the exact opposite. So that's the thing. It is kind of bizarre that you have all these products wide open, in the open, right? Apple Store, all this stuff. That it is so dependent and fragilely so on cultural norms, expectations of how we're going to handle those products. And when they get violated, my God, they get violated. Another example. So in New York City, I read an article about this. report about this, where because of all the outdoor scene that came up because of COVID, it actually had a slight benefit. Basically, we took over all the sidewalks and it became a more pedestrian-oriented city. And some of these were very expensive and elite restaurants. Guess what that did? Criminals came on mopeds, would come on motorcycles and mopeds, come right up, basically demand, basically pickpocket, basically steal from the patrons outside on the sidewalk, get on their motorcycle, fly away, just drive away. Again, why is that happening? Because the social structure and the cultural norms that go with it correlate. Another example, Robert Moses is very famous for his architecture, for his playgrounds and parks he built in Long Island. He tried doing exactly the same thing in Central Park and in other areas in New York City. Guess what happened? Pedophiles would basically creep on the kids at the brushery. Homeless people would go in the tubes, in the slide tubes and all that, and go to sleep. So same structure, same design, different cultural context that had to, and it blew up. All these things are dependent. So it's interesting because normally that is, Dan, your argument is a little different because what I'm presenting is usually said that the design is dependent upon these cultural events. The cultural stuff is all acting upon the design. The design is inert to it. It just has to respond. It just gets used in this context. You're pointing out the inverse of that, which is there are in some cases like the White Castle example where it's actually showing new cultural information and new ways of engagement. You can think of other examples, how Uber affects our travel, our patterns of travel, or ordering food, Tinder for dating, on Bumble for dating, etc. So you can present. So part of the nuance is pointing out when is the design and artifacts being made, basically acted upon a cultural trust dynamics, or when is it at times when it creates the conditions of trust, basically. So it's kind of interesting to talk through that. I'll give it back to you, Daniel.
No, but what's so it almost, in a sense, it's like the business no longer I'll speak generally. The business no longer has to think about the cultural information it's sending. Once it has institutions to give it trust, it just responds to the cultural signals that exist in the society that have those institutions, right? But if that's all failed, well, then they've actually got to turn around and do the thing they arguably should have always been doing, actually, or owning up to, because you're always sending some signals. There's always some sort of expectation you're creating based on your design. And if you don't think about it, well, then you might find yourself, if those institutions fail, you're not able to counter it. You're not able to teach an alternative kind of way of doing things, right? And I think what's very interesting about that is then that means there's a kind of way in which the entrepreneur, especially in a developing nation, has to simultaneously be a kind of architect or a kind of designer. Like they have to realize that they are the signal maker. It's like the reason why they can't be responding to the cultural signal is because, well, the cultural signal is bad. That means they just never start being an entrepreneurship, or it's not there, right? And if it's not there, then people are not signaled how to even interact with this business or the proper way to go about it, right? So you have to teach people. It's this weird thing where the entrepreneur has to teach the people how to interact with their very entrepreneurship in the same act of doing that work, which, of course, is one of the reasons why it's so hard to get things going, because you have to do this double role, right? But if you at least knew that, that would change things. You'd have a different mindset, right? You would be bringing in the designer and the architect and the cultural information, and to really be thinking. And actually, the big thing is the entrepreneur would make a point to say, go out in the community, meet people, let them know what they're doing, tell them what they're doing, explaining it, because this is also interesting where communication becomes very important, being a good communicator. Like an entrepreneur in a developing nation also has to be able to communicate their vision. Well, isn't that not what a good business owner does? And so basically also the suggestion for me of what Khan is suggesting is that there might be a principle of how to get to 0 to 1 when it comes to prosperity that actually would be better off if it was present the entire time, right? Like, it's not bad to have good institutions, but wouldn't it be great if humans could trust one another even with those institutions there? Like we actually had that muscle, not just simply relying on offloading it to stuff external from us. Well, what's interesting is if there is something about thinking and trust that go together, that muscle of more so internalizing trust seems to be tied to the very same muscle of philosophy, because it's tied to the muscle of thinking in a manner that's getting at trust versus deconstructing trust or trying to create a common basis, like a common thought or a common conversation or a dialogos, right? So there's a way in which, like, this is again where, to me, the philosophical, we could say, beauty and the kind of subjectivity we create is so important, because if there are not institutional means by which to continue cultivating it, it's only a matter of time before we're habituated by our outsourcing of trust to institutions to be incapable of trusting ourselves or to even know how to go thinking about it. And then if something happens where those institutions fail, or we're outside of the range, or we have to deal with problems they don't have answers to, then we're not going to be prepared for it, and we're actually going to prove unable to make, well, groups, communities, new businesses, new groups to deal with these new problems, right? Because how are you going to be able to form groups to deal with these new problems if you can't trust, right? And so social gathering, social coordination becomes impossible, basically, or very difficult for people. Oh, unless it's people that think like them. Oh, we go back to tribalism, right? We go back, it kills global pluralism. So that's what's happening, right? When you have the failure of institutions, which you outsource trust to. And Clayton, it is always a pleasure, and a happy new year to you as well. I'll be jumping as well due to obligation, but it's a treat, and we'll see if Luber comes back. But it's like you outsource to institutions trust, they fail. You now need to learn how to trust. You can't. So you go to the next thing to outsource to, and that's like you, right? Sharing into tribe. And that's not always bad, but under global pluralism, where that probably will be bad, right? And it tends to, unfortunately, lead to extremism or different things. Mr. Jockin.
We'll just build on that. So one part is this idea, just to clarify what we mean by this working on the conditions. That's an issue of delivery, distribution, and communications.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the idea of it. It's basically articulating the value proposition of your product, its use, its context, and to address the concerns or hesitations or ambiguity. Usually we're talking about the language of ambiguity. Yeah. Usually it's the removal of risk and ambiguity. So money back guarantees. Another a very famous example, probably saved the photography industry and one way to actually joke about it. Airbnb, when it first started, had no photos, couldn't get any sales. They started adding photography, or the photos that they were from users, and they were just shit, just super bad. No one wanted to go book Airbnb, so they did an experiment. Very famous. They took quality photography, massive spike. They had like a 10x effect on their sales, and that's why for a very long time Airbnb had a program of photographers. If you had a location, you could request Airbnb to come, and they would take professional photos for it. So this is an example of offloading obligations, or basically offloading responsibilities. So the vendor, the connector, the vendor here, Airbnb, is handling taking on onboarding the responsibility of the photography, because it's in both its self-interest as well as the host to help build trust with the potential patron who want to pay for it, because that's the risk, and they're using the imagery to judge. It goes similarly with restaurants. Basically, restaurants know good photography will help sell food sales much more successfully than other kinds of marketing. It's the same logic. It's not the product; it's the delivery and distribution of the product that matters just as much, if not more so, in the product being made. So I think that's actually quite important. I think your notes about synthesizing this note about what happens in institutions when we have to depersonalize, institutionalized trust that have been abstracted for so long. There's no direct connection to it. We just rely on the institutions that give trust. What happens when they break down? And if individuals can't do it, because it requires literally men of virtue. This is why we have a language like founding fathers and mothers for this reason. Meno, in the Platonic dialogue of Meno, talked about this. These men have to be touched by God, basically, to generate the first laws that make the society. And by the way, it's as in Credo, when Plato is confronted by the personification of the law and told, are you really going to abandon this city and go to other cities and try to proclaim say your words of the virtue, that goodness, virtue, justice, the laws, and the institutions are the most precious things of mankind when you ran away from the judgment of the law? Really?
So I'm just saying, like, so this idea of the essentialness of institutions. This is also why Sparta was this huge exemplar of virtue, because the point is their society was, as an institution, was so systematic. They literally basically shaped these men or everybody into virtue, because there was no way around it. Now, of course, it's always hilarious because there's always these great stories of when Spartans left Sparta, they would go insane. Basically, they had it was clear it was external force that was keeping them regulated. The minute they left the regulation, they just went wild. I remember that from Greek story, like reports from Greek historians about that. But and then your point is that these things break down, guess what's left? Co-similarity by the estimated power, bond, basically tribal bond pairing. That's all you get left. It's a logical necessity if there's no way around it. So that's what we're bringing up here. Either we have to build new institutions, which is why you're a little suspicious. That's why the Nobel Prize is kind of emphasizing, institutions, science. Good time. It's either that direction. That's what we're saying. It's either this direction. It seems like if this schema is working out, if we're agreeing with this schema, or the cultivation of individuated virtue that allows people to build an art of trust, basically, of friendship. I mean, if I had to spitball this off my hip, what would this be? It would have to be something like that, where basically people can, through their powers of dialogos, of understanding, of seeking to understand and be understood, finding commonality, basically finding ways to synergize together, use that language from Seven Habits in a way that is mutually beneficial, with an abundance mindset. I'm using all the Stephen Covey words now to talk about this. That'd be like a spitball. Now, of course, you don't have to, but that's the thing, though. See, the problem is that that's so antithetical because you know what it is? It's like, this is very similar to like, you can spend 3 years working out to get an amazing body, or you take the steroids and get it done, do plastic surgery and get it done in 6 months. You see, like, it's like the min-maxing optimization strategy point versus do this really hard, difficult thing. And it's going to take you a long time to actually get the results. And by the way, your note, actually, I think a big one is that, because you know what the institutions actually give you? This is the reason why this all works. It gives a time window of expectation. That you get a time. We always said this. Wisdom always seems to have this correlation of larger time durations. Now, I think a 10-year limit is pretty good. That's it's okay to get started, but that's the point. Like that, the size of that time box window. I'm just saying that because religious organizations have much larger time boxes. They're operating from a theological point of view. They're thinking about eternity, by the way. So outside that, but even their time references are much larger, right? So thus their considerations are different because of that. I think it's very important for me. I think that's a very important detail, just on a practical level of, I say that because we look at people's, like, I think of the bond market. Like the bond market and the 30-year bond, the 10-year bond, these are all estimations of the future, right? And that's actually having people's things are being affected by those estimations into the future. And how they influenced by the Fed. The Fed setting the interest rates and cutting it or increasing it. It's fascinating. All right. Daniel, I know you need to go, but I really enjoyed this conversation.
No, pleasure. What you just said, I strongly agree. Like, basically the choice now is between, I'll use that, like, bringing back the institutions or this cultivation of individuated virtue, right? And I think we're tempted by the steroid, bring back the institutions, which, we can do with force and monopoly on violence and threat and all that. And I think that's an option people, unfortunately, are considering. But again, if, it seems impossible to individuate, to spread the conditions of individuating virtue, what choice is there, right? Well, this is where also I think, like, the ultimate accelerant is AI, right? Just replacing everything with robotics and computing power. And so basically AI as Calzer, AI as the kind of Nick Land capital, is forcing, well, you guys better figure out, if you really take that seriously and what it's doing, in my opinion, to say something that's not fully justified, but if you grant it to me, if AI is forcing that, and AI is the logic of institutions, this is very important. Like in Belonging, we talk about Mary Douglas, and her life. She wrote an amazing book called How Institutions Think, that I really like as a sociologist, and people don't read it. And basically what I want to do, and we may have talked about it, is the difference between dolphins and apes is that dolphins are smart but don't gather around a campfire. They don't socialize. whereas, monkeys do, and then that gives you humans. But that's the logic of institutions, okay? So the logic of institutions and collectives give you the possibility of society while simultaneously weakening your individuated capacities. That also gives you technology, that gives you capital, that gives you AI. It's all the same trajectory. It's all the same kind of thinking, right? That is basically outsourced thinking, outsourced to the collective, outsourced to the technology. And of course, these things are great as long as they exist with the human versus the human saying, I'm just going to have that replace me, right? So, but if that's all so, if that's all so, then basically the only address is some sort of spread of individuated virtue, right? That's the only way to do it. And that's hard. But that's there's only one road left, and that's the hard road. And we have to do that. It won't be too good. Just be AI will have its way, I suppose. So I really like that way that you put it there, Mr. Jockin.
I appreciate that too. No, because I was just building on that point. Because the point is, like, these institutions don't hold without individuals. Like, their ground base fundamentally is on the integrity of the individuals inside them.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, like, they have the momentum. I haven't read this book, How Institutions Think. My instinct would probably tell me, thinking what it probably talks about. Institutions have momentum, meaning, like, they can work on their own operation.
Yes, that's right.
But that only can last for so long if the things inside them are hollowed out. So, for example, when we see in the scientific community where basically falsified data, plagiarism, things like that, like, they're violating the integrity. This is why that language integrity is actually quite important. Like, if the integrity of your discipline or your institution is annihilated, like Joe Biden basically pardoning his son when he said he wasn't going to do it at the very end. I don't want to be political. I'm just saying it's a pretty egregious episode of that. It's almost, these things are, you're destroying from the inside what the institutions are.
Yeah.
So that's the point. It's like, if it's almost like, just like we offload our thought, or just like we get caught up in thinking, like, kind of an obsession where we think by thinking about we're going to solve our problems, right? We think that we can just offload it off to institutions and they're going to solve our problems for us. When in reality, that's not their role. The best they can do is give a clearing. Just like how in sports are artifice that allow for the clearing of the beautiful. I like to I think about it that way. Meaning, like, just like also like a planetarium or arboretum, they shine their beauty of nature by giving clearings of beauty, by clearings of nature. It's a similar property. Where these are artifices go on, sorry.
No, not that, but I was just going to say the point of offloading thought was supposed to make clearings for creativity, virtue, and beauty. Like, I offload my thought to writing so that I can be more creative, right? Like, but the problem is we offload and we're not creative, so then we're just, I don't know what we are. That's where artificial intelligence is, right? Like, offloading was to open clearings, but what we've done is offloaded and just not thought at all. Yeah, and I guess I would say then that writing, like the logic of campfire, collective, institution writing is also on there, offloading to the written word, and again, when we can offload thought to the written word, we can be more creative. We can focus more on practices or philosophical dialogues, and we don't have to remember so much. Well, we've talked about the difference between remember, etc., and recollect, but offloading thought is a tremendously wonderful thing if it opens up clearings of beauty, if it opens up creativity, if it makes space for cultivating virtue. If not, it's like pure self-effacement. Like that's just self-effacement. Then you're offloading and not doing. You're offloading yourself to do nothing. Well, what else is self-effacement but that, right? Like, you're offloading your substance in order not to cultivate more, but to, like, die. So that's what's happening. Like, there's a offloading, but not for the sake of creativity. So it becomes very, very bad. And I guess I would also say that I very strongly, like, on this the distinction between individuated virtue and institutions. I very strongly resist any argument that suggests that at the very basis of all social creation, economic creation, human creation is not something like an individuated virtue. Like the idea that no, it's strong institutions, no, it's the stimulation of demand, no, it's liquidity, no, it's science, no, it's technology. Also, you mentioned science. I think every friggin' American needs to really like learn how the peer review process works. Like they think it's some like magical objective system. Like they have no idea how, in my opinion, it happens. And once you learn that, you go, "Are you kidding me?" You know, it's not what you think. When the peer review system is insane. But at the basis of it is some sort of individuated virtue, and it is a raw human element, and nothing replaces it. You can create environments that better suit for it. You can create spaces where it's easier to come out, but you can never ever replace the individuated virtue. That is going to be ultimately what creates wealth. That's going to be what ultimately creates technology, entrepreneurship, society, interaction, and different things like that. And no matter how hard it is, and yes, at scale, the greater the scale, the more difficult it is to do because you're dealing with more surprises, encounters, differences, first principles. But no matter how difficult it gets, it's still the same address. It never changes. Like you can want it to change. You can say, well, it's too hard now. Well, then I guess we're screwed. Like just because it's too hard doesn't mean the answer changes, right? It's the same address.
I mean, Daniel, to jump in, I mean, as much as we can't even comprehend this, but the Greek position was the whole point of the laws were to make us virtuous.
Yeah.
Right. Like the whole purpose of the institution and the laws that come with it are to make us virtuous. That was the whole logic of it. So there was no separation of it. It wasn't like there was completely separate entities. They were meant to be in union with each other. We make laws so that people become good. That was the logic. We don't think that at all. We absolutely know. And by the way, and factually so. I mean, the laws we have now are not operating for those purposes, but for other things instead. So I think that's right there. Part of the tension is that we don't realize that the habituations happen from the systems. I talk about this in my course, like the idea of like the structure of a UX, UI habituates certain behaviors and certain patterns. You don't see that. So in one sense, so that's the thing. It's that there is an issue about the question of how much of virtue needs to be cultivated by individuals in full awareness versus the virtue that's generated through institutions and habituations. What I mean by that is, for example, the boxing gym has a certain habitus, right? To kind of use that language of there's a certain habituation that occurs when you go to the gym and practices in that gym. And quite bluntly, some are going to be better boxers than others, but all will become boxers through the activity if they keep going by that structure, that institution, let alone its relationship to other boxing gyms and the matches and whatnot that occur. So that's like, that would be the boxing gym is the sports gym in that way. It's actually the best example I can give you to what the laws are supposed to, like institutions of law or commerce are supposed to do for the citizens, the people who are participating in that. It's a similar dynamic. It's supposed to be like that.
Well, I would just say to that, I strongly agree. But that, to me, suggests that thinking is way more in the business of architecture than it realizes. It should be. We don't think geometrically, as you know, I always say with Leibniz, it's like everything is architecture, everything is space, everything is environment, everything is incubation. Like we're thinking to solve problems, not to create spaces in which can better afford virtue than others, right? Because I think that's exactly the case. I mean, Belonging Again 3 is obsessed with architecture because it's all architecture. Like it's all like the best sociologists are all about the habitus that is cultivated by the visuals of the sign, the visual cues, the visual information, everything. Like if virtue is the way, which it is, then it's all about design, architecture, and spaces and the cultivation of, say, movement and all of that stuff, which we don't think so, but that is virtue. That is the thinking of virtue, if you will. That's what we need to think, not just technical problems. Because if it's technical problems, then the things we offload to will do that for us, and we have no role, right? You know. And so I loved also what you said, like, in the same way that the point of the law is supposed to be for virtue. I guess the last thing I'd say is that the point of offloading is supposed to be for humans to be creative. Like if you offload certain things to the economy, it's to make space for you to be more creative, to create wealth, right? Like offloading is to open up clearings of creativity, right? Like the point of the economy is to make you creative, in the same way that the law is supposed to make you virtuous, right? Like the economy is supposed to help you be a creative being, right? Now that, of course, has to be expanded on, but the economy is to create the conditions where you can experiment, where you can try new things and try to go about solving problems that have not been solved. It is not merely about making you wealthy or giving you money, right? Like it has a higher aim of helping you think things, of giving you the space to think things you otherwise may never think, right? That's a joy of leisure, right? So the point, like you could say that a point of the economy is leisure in that higher sense, not just lazy, but like the meditation, the scole or whatever, right? So likewise, the point of law is virtue. Likewise, the point of institutions is precisely so that as you learn to trust with human beings, since that's so hard and mushy, if you fail, you have something to fall back on. It's supposed to provide a safety net for the messy, imprecise process of learning how to trust individuals, so that when you inevitably screw up, you can at least have a basis to fall back on and try again, not to not try, right? And so that, like all of these things have a different function from what we think it is, right? Like you say, law, virtue, economy, scole, and creativity, because I associate those things together. Like learning, learning is in fact to encounter what you don't know, not what you know, right? It's all these sort of little things. And I think what does give me hope is a lot of what would be to cultivate or spread the conditions of individuated virtue is not necessarily the making of anything that doesn't already exist, but the changing of our relation to what already exists. Like we just change our perspective of the law. We don't need, and then go through the law and get rid of the ones that aren't needed, but it's not like you're getting rid of law in general, right? You're just changing your perspective, right? So likewise, you're changing what you think schools are there for. You're changing what you think institutions are there for. Like if this problem of the belonging again address was one of adding something new, I think that would be very difficult. That's where you get these bloody revolutions or totalitarian, because we've got to add something to everything, right? But if it's a changing of relation to what is, well, that doesn't necessarily have to force anything upon people, right? From their own unique conditions, whatever they may individuate it that as and want it to be, they can change their view for their own sake, right? For their, like, does not the man want to be more virtuous than not, right? You don't have to be, but now from your own unique condition, you at least have afforded to you a perspective that opens that possibility, right? For the beautiful, the good, and the true, right? So that's what the address has to be. It has to be a realization, not additive or negative. If you say, well, we got to make sure nobody can buy something so it doesn't destroy the ocean. And well, once you do that, you're in huge trouble. So it can't be subtractive, nor can it be additive. It has to be realization. It has to be seeing what is in a different way. Like you say, see the law for cultivating virtue, right? See institutions as safety nets as you learn to trust individuals. See the economy as cultivating creativity and leisure, not just to make you money or consumables, right? That's just a change of perspective. But Mr. Jockin, thank you for your time this evening, sir. I've really enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you always.
Of course, it's a pleasure, Daniel. Have a good week hanging there with the work.
I look forward to it. Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Jockin. Always a treat. It's always an honor and delight to speak with you, sir. Thank you.
Likewise.